Hey there, and thanks for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'm Chris, aka the Brick Archivist, and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews. If you don't know, this series is focused on reviewing all of the fan-created and canonized Bionicle models. Over the course of its long run, and still ongoing to this day, many fan-created models are run through contests either run by LEGO or by Bionicle fan sites like TTV message boards or BZP, and are officially canonized by Greg Farshtey, which is the current story guardian of Bionicle. So far, we've taken a look at a member of the Order of Matanui, Tobduck, who is a fearsome, tall warrior. Now we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. Of course, the original leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta, until he wasn't, Makuta Miserix. So, let's go. Alright, so here in all his glory is the original leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta, Makuta Miserix. This model was created by a fan named Sarah Newkirk and was accepted into canon after winning a Build a Makuta contest. Now, this was quite a few years ago, and just to give a quick rundown of this guy's backstory, essentially he was the original leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta until he was kind of overthrown by Pterodax. He had a quick fight with him, Pterodax convinced the other Makuta to side with him, and eventually he was sentenced to be executed by Makuta Krika. However, instead, Krika took mercy on him and just imprisoned him instead, which kind of kept him around in the story until late game, where of course he gets free and tries to wreak havoc while Makuta had already taken control of the Matanui robot body. This guy was the person that paid off Takedox to betray the League of Six Kingdoms, which causes a lot of drama in the 2007 Bionicle story. So even though he was pretty much behind the scenes and imprisoned for most of the story, all the way up until the main climax near the end, he had a pretty major role in the history of the Makuta and basically the history of the Bionicle Universe as a whole. So a pretty important character here. And now let's take a look at this model. Before we get started, I wanted to note there are a few minor things that I have actually modified based on the official model. First of all, the claws should be transparent red. I do agree that would fit in his color scheme a little bit more. For whatever reason, I couldn't find transparent red Borak eyes laying around my collection, or at least not 8 of them, so I gave him the same color as his eyes here, the trans neon fluorescent green, which hopefully won't be too much of a detractor. And all of his fingers are supposed to be red instead of one orange, and again, this was just because I just couldn't find all the parts for it, but hopefully it's not a big deal, and it kind of does blend in with the color scheme. So I actually built this model off of instructions that are posted on YouTube. I've put a link in the description below of those instructions. I am sure that a few things are not 100% accurate to the official model. For instance, the instructions asked for me to use CCBS specifically for attaching some points along his feet here. CCBS didn't exist by the time that this had won the contest, so I know that's definitely wrong. As well as a few odds and ends like Technic pins that weren't around at the time that this was built, but I think in general, overall, this is the basically aesthetically how the model would work, and function-wise, it is, of course, 100% how it would function as well. So without further ado, let's get started and take a look at this review. As suggested by a commenter on Eurobricks, I will be structuring this review among a few key points that I feel are important for a model like this. And so these 4 main categories are aesthetics, functionality, building techniques, and representation. And specifically what I mean by representation is that for certain models, they were specifically made to be built around a certain character. And this will become a little bit more important as we get into, say, the TTV canonization contest entries, where the models were specifically built after a written description by Greg Farshtey in the story. But essentially for this one, the example would be, does this look like a realistic Makuta? Does it kind of fit in with the rest of the Makuta sets that we got, and so on? But let's get started with aesthetics. So, moving it all around, you can see that this is a very impressive and large model. And it does have a ton of really unique building techniques as well. You can see a really inventive use of the Paraka Radax spine here, which actually gives him a bit of a spine going back. And the head is actually really well integrated as kind of an area for the neck to emerge outwards. And then moving all along, what impresses me the most about this model is the torso build, where a lot of unique pieces have been stacked together to create a lot of interesting shapes using pieces that maybe weren't intended for that purpose. We have a Kalma head, which is just like a squid head of one of the Baraki, featured right here, which fits right in with the color scheme, combined with a Mantax chest piece, which looks really great, looking like this, and it's actually mounted at an angle. So what the Machus did was actually use these pneumatic Technic T-pieces to attach the armor piece not by the Technic pins, but instead by the lightsaber bar length holes in the front, and then attach those to the rest of the body via Technic means. So I think that's something that's really cool. Even going down here, we have the Rakshi spines in silver, which really complete the look. And I feel like out of everything on this model, the torso area is the most well done, with a bit of a minor exception, and we'll get to that later in the build. Moving onwards to the arms, this is where I do have a few minor quibbles. If you look at the arm just on the side here, you'll notice that it looks really gappy. And the reason for this is because they used a red Rakshi spine right here. But the problem is it's not really filled out underneath. So what you get is you kind of get this curve that goes over the arm, and it looks a little bit more like an armor piece that's sticking out rather than his actual arm, which I do think it was actually meant to be part of his actual arm. And it does make the rest of his arm look a little bit too skinny in that area. So just a minor con, but again, this was built several years ago, so it's obviously not the most advanced Mach in terms of building techniques, and we'll get to those advanced ones when we get to the TTV contest. Moving on to his hands, let's look at the one that isn't holding his staff for now. This is actually, I do appreciate the shaping on this one. They used the Hordika chest piece armor to kind of cover up any awkwardness in terms of how the hands were attached. I don't know how I feel about the tips being black. I feel like maybe dark red would have been a better choice, which is actually why I replaced the palms with dark red as well. These are actually all supposed to be black, but I made it dark red to really fit in better with the color scheme. And so I do think that it probably would have been a little bit better like that. Overall, the aesthetics are pretty good. The Machus used the Elec claws to really seem like there's this silver armor kind of going alongside the whole arm, which is something I do appreciate. It does look like it flows pretty well. So I do like that. And of course we have this Knights Kingdom and Exoforce armor pieces being used up top for the shoulders, which again needed some CCBS. I'm sure that this was mounted with just, I mean, I can see exactly how this was mounted in the original one, probably just with the axle pieces, but it's actually made a little bit stronger with CCBS, but you don't need it to do this. And then moving on to the tail here, this is where things get, quite frankly, a little bit wonky. The way that this tail is attached is that it's literally just attached by one Technic pin. And I'm going to zoom in the camera here so you can see. So it's literally just attached by Technic beam and pin. Again, this might not be the fault of the person who built this. It may be the fault of the instructions, but they did have me attach it like that, which I felt was really strange and just kind of makes it super wobbly. And of course it's kind of held in by the legs, but then that causes some major stability issues with the legs, which we'll get to in a second. The tail itself is also generally pretty floppy and it doesn't really stay up, which you can see here. Again, this may just be due to my old parts and the joints that I'm using, but it really has a hard time staying up. And obviously you could use one of the modern friction pieces to fix that, but I'm just evaluating the Mach based on how it's built. And in general, the tail construction is really just pretty basic. The end piece of the tail I actually do kind of like. They use the Rakshi spine to pretty good effect here and have a nice effect with the flame kind of sticking out, but the rest of it is really basically just stacking these Bionicle limbs, and there's nothing too crazy going on, and especially for the really fun building techniques used with integrating the Paraka spine here, I would have really liked to see some more interesting builds done for the tail to make it a little more than just limbs stacked together, which it is kind of like that right now. But, well, speaking of the limbs, it tends to kind of do that from time to time, and I don't know if this is specifically just how I build it, but maybe my joints were just a little bit weak, but yeah, the legs really do not support the body that well. And that gets us to probably my main issue with this build, is specifically how the legs are constructed. Oh, we just lost his head. Let me just attach that guy. It takes a lot of fiddling just to get this guy to stand up straight at all. And there's a reason why a lot of the, let's say, promotional artwork of this has been taken with him resting one hand on the ground, and that's probably because it's really hard to actually get him in a good pose to stand him up on his two legs. So, yeah, maybe, okay, let's see. If I mess around with it a little bit here, you'll notice that his torso kind of collapses as well. You need to push this up and make sure this piece is locked in, so it's kind of a little bit of a strange building technique here. The arms also do not really support the weight, especially with the staff being held, so there is that, and again, weak pieces, but it could have been done a little bit better. I could have seen some more friction pieces added in the back. When you do get him in a standing position, it does look fine, but of course I'm cheating a little bit by, oh, there it goes again. I'm cheating a little bit by resting his tail on the ground, and his legs are still collapsing, so this one requires a lot of fiddling, and if anyone else has built this model on their own, let me know if you guys have this same issue. I've tried swapping out the joints for different pieces. I thought at first it was because of my parts. Again, maybe it could be because the tutorial that I worked off of had a slightly incorrect build for the legs, although looking at official pictures, it does look pretty accurate, so honestly at this point I really don't know. After this review, I'm going to just slap on like a ton of friction adder pieces onto the legs, and hopefully that'll solve some of the problems. But of course, if we're talking about just aesthetics, let's lift this guy up so he stops falling. Aesthetically, the legs look fine. I think they actually look pretty good. I really like how they use the Mata limbs as toes here. It actually gives it a very reptilian look, and you can kind of interpret this bit right here as scales. So I actually do really appreciate that. The Borak flame piece to kind of cover up the awkward type of joining together Technic parts is similar to the technique used for the Hordika armor piece on the hands here, but it's a good technique. I appreciate that. And it actually blends pretty well. You can see the Rakshi feet used here blend pretty well with the Hordika chest armor. So that's actually a pretty decent build. But as far as the rest of the legs go, it's honestly nothing too complex. It's literally just limb pieces that are stacked together. So nothing like too fancy going on here. Oh, part just came off. And the other thing is that the way that these are built, and I'm actually pretty sure this is due to the instructions, but they required this very special Technic piece to be used. It is a piece that I know did not exist by the time of this, so I'm sure the legs are built slightly differently in the official model, but as they're built right now, they're pretty restricted and actually can tend to fall apart a little bit, so that's not great. And I guess the final thing we have to talk to in terms of aesthetics is the head. And you know what? I actually really like this head. I think it's a really cool looking head. You can really see the horns, and it's almost like he has antlers near the top here. The only thing that I wish was a little bit different was that I wish that he could just open his mouth. His mouth is permanently closed, which I feel is a bit of a miss. You definitely could have integrated some sort of opening function here, especially because it uses that claw piece that the Ultimate Duma set uses, which can open its mouth. So I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity. However, it is a very unique parts usage here to use the foot piece of an Anika build as the front of the mouth. So applause to that. That's really cool. And the other thing about the head that I feel is a little bit awkward is that it uses these Technic beams to secure the Pohatu Nuva climbing claws on the sides. They kind of just stick out a little bit, and they don't have anything really covering them, and I question really why these were needed. I feel like if you just remove them, they wouldn't make too much of a difference, so it adds some bulk to the head, but not detailed bulk. And then of course you have his staff, and the staff is alright. It's nothing fancy whatsoever, but it does its job fine. There's a bit of an illegal building technique used to attach the Hordika Vakama flame staffs here. You'll notice that they don't actually go all the way into the Technic pins, so that's a bit of a miss in my opinion, the fact that it does that. But otherwise, if you look at it from a distance, it looks pretty good, and I have no major complaints with it. So in terms of posability, there are a lot of points of articulation, and to be quite frank, I'm not certain that that's a good thing, because there's just a lot of stuff that you have to pay attention to when posing this model. Specifically, obviously you've got the head can move forward and back and can separate from time to time depending on how rough you are with it, but he's got 2 points of articulation here to kind of move it, and of course one more down in the neck to get some more articulation, so the head is well articulated, that's fine. You can move around the armor on different ball joints here, so it's kind of good to be able to pose that around and move it around. And his arms have basically the standard, you can see here he's got the elbow, although that is a little bit restricted by the Elec blade piece here that kind of hits the back, so he can't really just stretch out his arm all the way. And of course you can move his hand and all of his fingers and little fingertips as well, which is always a nice touch. The Ultimate Duma set actually did the very similar thing with the hand build here too. Same thing goes for the other hand, and he can also This isn't intentional, but he can wiggle around a lot of stuff on his torso, and this is actually one of the more annoying things about the build is that, like, this is really loose and it can really just kind of wiggle around. You kind of have to get it straight. It can very easily be bumped around when you're moving the arms, so this really isn't one that you'd use for play. It's really just a display model. You really can't just play around with it and pose it. The other thing is that there are some Technic beams here used to fill in the space. These are really, really easy to just get dislodged because they're only held on by one axle, so there is that. And the legs themselves have a pretty limited... There goes another piece, okay. The legs themselves have a pretty limited range of motion, and the reason for this is just the way that they've been constructed in order to hold these feet pieces on. They're using some Technic beams to kind of hold them together, and you can kind of move it around the tail to kind of get a more wide variety of legs, but quite frankly, this is really the best you're gonna get, and it's not necessarily a con to me, because I don't also see this guy moving his legs all the way back as well, but it's just something to keep in mind. This articulation here with the knee is really limited because you're kind of restricted to two different limb pieces here that are stacked next to each other, and they're slightly different lengths, so that doesn't really help in terms of making it move all that well. But then the feet, you can generally pretty well move this around, and you can kind of see how this all function works together. Of course, you can move around his toes, but the rest of the foot is pretty fixed, and you can even move his back toe as well, which is nice. And then the tail, which we talked about earlier, lots of points of articulation, maybe a little too much. I would have preferred something that was just a little bit more stable. Obviously, you can see this just really flopping around there, and this isn't really a good thing to have for a model of this size, but I understand it was built with pretty rudimentary building techniques, and it was a very early canonization contest, so I'll give it a little bit of slack there. But let's just reset this guy into a position where you can, well, actually see him in all his glory. And so that brings us to our final point. How well does this actually fit within the universe? So the prompt for the contest was to build a model of a Makuta. So at first glance, perhaps this character, if you remove the staff and maybe placed him on all fours, this could very easily be seen as just a Rahi. But I can see why that may turn a few people off from seeing how well he would fit in with the rest of the Makuta. But that being said, if you think back to 2008, a lot of the Makuta actually had animal-like forms. Of course, we got the bat-like members of the Brotherhood of Makuta, so they were very animal-like. Even their masks looked like bats and whatnot. They had bat wings and different types of animal limbs sticking out of them. And then in the second half of the year, we got insect-like Makuta. So we got like Dorast and Biddle and Krika and whatnot. And these were very, very much clearly inspired by animals and insects. So frankly, the animal aesthetic here is really kind of okay to me. The more I think about it, the more it makes sense that the leader of the Makuta would kind of mold himself after looking like a dragon, a very regal creature. And he can obviously, it says that he can change his shape within the lore. So if I wanted to look like an imposing leader, I potentially would change my shape into this as well. I mean, this is a very outwardly imposing guy, and it actually fits pretty well within canon. It's like described within certain stories, like the Federation of Fear, that people rode on his back while they were breaking him out of his jail. So he's obviously at a scale that's much, much larger than a lot of the other people kind of within the universe. And I think that makes a lot of sense as the leader of the Brotherhood of Makuta. Could I have wished that it included a little bit more of a humanoid look and less so of a Rahi look, like maybe losing the tail a little bit, because the tail doesn't add too much to me? Maybe, but at the same time, that would take away a little bit from the dragon aesthetic here. So I do appreciate it for what it is. In terms of the overall aesthetics, I think this is done very well. If you ignore posability and functionality and just look at it head on, this looks like an imposing creature. And if you kind of ignore some of the more wonky gaps in building techniques, I'd give this one a solid 7.5 to 8 out of 10 in terms of aesthetics. In terms of how well it fits in the universe, I would give it probably around the same score. It makes sense to me. But then we get into some of the cons of the model, which are a little bit unfortunate. And again, I want to reiterate what I said in our very first set of reviews. I am very, very impressed with all of the models that have been canonized. And I'm really proud of all of the creators who put in the effort to get their mock accepted into the Bionicle canon. That's something that's super impressive to me. So well done for the creators. And I also want to acknowledge that this was built with very limited pieces. This was built, of course, while Bionicle was still ongoing, so there were a lot of stuff that comes out today that the creator didn't have access to. I don't even know how well or reliable Bricklink was in order of getting parts, so this is obviously a very impressive creation for what it is, given the limitations. Of course, though, I am reviewing exactly what has been canonized, so I do need to nitpick a little bit here. And unfortunately, the fact that the legs are so weak and it's just so easy to collapse this guy, as you saw so many times throughout the video, just really is a major con to me. And it's not just the legs being able to collapse, it's just overall the fact that moving the arms and the way that the Toa Nuva chest armor is placed can easily dislodge the centering of this chest piece. Yep, it wasn't centered just then. And even the tail is just built kind of strangely and flops around. So in terms of posability, if you can get it into a cool looking pose, it's gonna look really awesome. But you're gonna have some trouble getting it into that pose. And that's why I'm giving it an even split 5 out of 10. It's really nice looking when you can get it to pose right, but getting it in that position is just a pain. In terms of building techniques, this is also something I'm really torn on, because the torso, as I said, is done really well, and I think a lot of the work in terms of building this model and making it have unique building techniques went into the torso, and to an extent the head, which I think is also done really well. Unfortunately for me, it kind of tends to fall apart a little bit when you move into the legs, especially. The stability is definitely something to take into account when we're talking about building techniques, as well as, of course, this tail here, which is made up of very rudimentary limbs slapped together, and even the arms are really gappy in terms of the building techniques. But because the body is just so well designed when it does work, I'm going to give this a 6.5 out of 10 in terms of building techniques. So when we sum that all up, we get a 27.5 out of 40, which I know that sounds not great, but honestly, for what it is, I'm really impressed with this model. I'm typically against giving numerical scores because I feel like they don't really represent how well I feel after building the model. I am very pleased to have this in my collection, despite the issues with the stability and falling over. Mostly what I do with my Bionicle stuff is just leave them on the shelf and pose them in a group together anyways. So the fact that it takes a lot of time to get this in the right position is really not that big of an issue for me. I understand it could be an issue for a lot more people, but for me personally, not a big deal because I just like displaying my Bionicles anyway, and I don't really use them too much for play, which is definitely not what this model is made for. I think if you tried to play with this model, it would just fall apart. So there is that, and overall, I think I'm really pleased with this model, and I think now is the time where we can maybe take a look at some of the inspirations that Makis have gone taking this model and building it into something new. So a few weeks back, a user named Avalon on Twitter reached out to me in the comments of my YouTube channel, asked me to check out his Miserix mock, and usually I don't really do too much mock spotlights if they're not actually canon, but this one really blew me away. It's the most faithful interpretation of this character, but just upgraded, and I feel like in any case, if let's say we didn't have an official image of this guy and there was a canonization contest, this model would have a really good chance of winning because it takes this idea, it stays really true to the aesthetics of this design and just upgrades it, both aesthetically and it looks a lot more stable too. And at some point, I'd really love to be able to build that one myself. Maybe at some point down the line, I'll be able to order parts. I know the creator mentioned that he was working on instructions to be released sometime next month, so I'm definitely staying tuned for that. And you can see a picture right now. I've also linked it in the description below. And to me, this model is basically an improvement in almost every way. He takes the relatively simple staff and adds really unique shaping in the form of the Tahu Hao, which I never would have thought of to use for a shaping on a staff. And it looks really good like that and fills in a lot of the awkward technic gaps around here. The arms and legs are done much better, even the tail, and the chest itself is just improved so much, even more so than what it is right now. So I'd highly recommend for you guys to check that out. I'm really impressed with that mock, and if I ever get my hands on it to build it, then I will definitely be doing a whole separate video on that if people are interested. But I guess that about wraps up this review, and to end, I'm going to bring over a few representative size samples of his other members of the Brotherhood of Makuta, just so you can kind of get a feel of how big this guy is compared to the rest of them. so I'll be right back. Alright, so our first comparison here is, of course, Makuta Pterodax himself, the guy that overthrew him. And the first thing I wanted to see is that, would there even be a realistic fight between these two? Are they properly scaled to actually have a fight with each other like they did in the lore? And I'm happy to say that, of course, while he towers over Pterodax, I'd be able to see Pterodax kind of going up against this guy in a fight. They're pretty reasonably scaled. He's not extremely large compared to Pterodax here, so I'd say it's a pretty decent comparison. The next comparison is probably the closest that we're going to get to a model of a massive scale official Makuta like this, and that of course is the quote-unquote Ultimate Duma set, and I wouldn't even say this is canon. I'd say this is pretty semi-canon at best, because the model that appeared in Legends of Metro Nui looked nothing like this. It was literally just Pterodax with wings. But let's just get this guy posed up, and you can kind of see how this works together. The funny thing is that the hand is built almost in the identical way that this one's built, so that's kind of interesting to me. But okay, so we got this guy here. And yeah, to be honest, they scale pretty well next to each other. Obviously, this is a much more advanced build, but you can really see that this is an example member of the Brotherhood of Makuta. They work pretty much in scale with each other. And then we have the standard, let's say, Inika type build of any of the 2008 Makuta, which you can see here. And he's actually pretty comparable to Pterodax as well, so if we put him all the way up in front, yeah, I can very easily see them working in scale to each other. And that's the final thing I wanted to consider in terms of how well does this fit in universe, because sometimes people build these amazingly massive mocks that are supposedly around the same size as everyone else, and it doesn't make too much sense. But with these examples here and representative samples, I'd say it does a pretty good job overall. But so, that about wraps up our review of Makuta Miserix. I hope you enjoyed, and please leave a comment down below if you have built this guy. I would love to hear your experience with him. Does he fall over as much as mine does, or are my joints just loose? And I really want to know from you guys if anyone has built this, and I'd love to hear suggestions in the comments below as to what model I should cover next. And stay tuned to Duck Breaks for even more LEGO news, reviews, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye for now.